Our speaker tonight is Professor John R. Todd of Rochester University. John is a U of M graduate and he earned his law degree at the Georgetown Law School. He has taught government and law classes for the past 40 years. John served in Vietnam as an Army officer and gunship pilot and earned the following decorations: the Distinguished Flying Cross for Valor, a dozen combat air medals, and the Purple Heart. Our speaker was a spokesman for President Nixon on Vietnam issues. He also was the state chairman for the Vietnam Veterans Leadership Program for President Reagan. He was the Outstanding Disabled Veteran of the Year in 2013 and has recently been nominated for the Albert Nelson Lifetime Achievement Award from Who's Who in America. His topic this evening is the Vietnam War, Myths and Truths. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Todd.
Good evening. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here tonight. I have been thinking and researching this ever since about 4 months ago, President Zimmerman contacted me. And it is a pleasure to be here at the Rochester Hills Public Library. It is a beautiful building. It has a great collection, but most importantly, it is staffed by wonderful, competent people. And one of them is here tonight. Karen Weidman is here. And then also Tiffany Zimmerman is the new employee. So the Rochester Library, like Andrew Carnegie once said, a library is the best gift that a community can give to its people. It's an unfailing spring in a desert of ignorance. So we're privileged to be here. Now, I'm going to begin to set the stage that what led up to the Vietnam War. And it really began in 1945. In February of 1945, President FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Yalta. They not only divided up the world, but they created at least 3 problems that would doom their children for the next 30 years. Those problems were a cruelly surrounded Berlin, North Korea, and North Vietnam. Now, and I know that we have some people my age here, and I just turned 73, and so I still feel as I did when I was 22. So buckle your seatbelts, please. Now, after Yalta, and after the atom bombs in Japan, in August of 1945, the very next day, a new war began, the Cold War. And that was competition between the USSR, the United States, and the free world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it was like between 1945 and 1963, because those days, those issues, those people are what set us up for the Vietnam War. First of all, in 1947, the Soviets began to sponsor insurgencies, communist insurgencies in Greece and Turkey. Immediately, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine that basically said this: the United States will assist any democratic nation that faces external or internal force by the communists. We will aid them militarily, economically, and politically. And here is the key point about the Truman Doctrine. He also requested that aid, including military aid, including troops. And he received bipartisan support. Back in 1946, 47, and up to about 1968, Democrats and Republicans, both in Washington and in hometowns across the country, supported anti-communist efforts. They supported the Truman Doctrine. In 1949, as you know, Mao Zedong took China. And a future president criticized his own President Truman by saying that Truman had lost China. That congressman was John F. Kennedy. Later, after 49, in April of 1950, we have the beginning of the Korean War. And I apologize for, in a minute, I'm going to tell you some terrible statistics. The Korean War, the war itself, actually lasted about 2 years. And in 2 years, the United States lost 50,000 soldiers killed or missing, and they later died. Let's do some math. 50,000 in 2 years is 25,000 per year. Let's take 2 weeks off for vacation, 50 weeks. Between 1950 and 1952, the United States lost 500 soldiers killed or wounded, and they lost 500 every week for 2 years. And Democrats and Republicans in Washington and in hometowns where the Gold Star mothers lived put up with that. Because at that time, the United States was zealously anti-communist. In 1952, we have a new Republican administration. The great war hero of World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, was elected with his vice president, Richard Nixon. Their theory and their strategy, put about by John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, literally was called containment. And in the 50s, Dulles, Eisenhower, and Democrats and Republicans in the Senate established 3 or 4 treaties: NATO, CENTO, and SEATO, SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, along with the Australia-New Zealand Military Pact. That treaty was ratified in the United States Senate in 1955 with 1 vote against it. Again, bipartisanship, Democrats and Republicans. Now, by the way, later on we will get into Vietnam, don't worry. But in that treaty, like all of Dulles and Eisenhower's treaty, that was called a mutual defense treaty. Here's what that meant. All of the signatories, the nations who agreed to the treaty, would consider an attack on any one of them to be an attack on all. Thus, if one nation invaded France or Germany, and NATO was a big treaty, we had tens of thousands of troops, including Elvis Presley there, guarding the Fulda Gap. And if Russian tanks came into Germany, all of the NATO nations would fight back, including the United States. Now also, we need to understand exactly what a treaty is. In the United States Constitution, Article 4 states this: the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States are the supreme law of the land. A treaty is a solemn promise made by the United States to foreign nations. And again, we made those promises willingly. And indeed, the truth of the matter is, Eisenhower and Dulles really cajoled and forced the South Vietnamese to join the SEATO Treaty. The United States was very much responsible for putting North and South Vietnam at odds. Now, also, in 1959, you'll remember, Fidel Castro takes over Cuba. And John F. Kennedy again blamed a president for losing Cuba to the communists. Later, in 1960, we have the great Watershed election. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. I want you to recall, and I'm sure many of you do, that in that election was the very first presidential TV debate. And I'm sure most of you watched it. But you probably don't remember that John F. Kennedy spoke first. And without even a question from Howard K. Smith. And he began by saying this. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln gave his House divided speech, which stated, "Our nation cannot survive half free and half slave." And then Kennedy, with his great rhetorical skill, said, "And in 1960, the world cannot survive half free and half slave." Need I tell you who he was talking about, both on the free side and the slave side? I don't think so. Later, during the campaign of 1960, John F. Kennedy brought forth literally a bar graph on I think it was on an easel, called the missile gap. And this is how many the United States had, and this is how many Russia had. That was the missile gap. And he blamed the Republicans for being weak on communism. Now a personal story, if I may. In 1961, I made a Babe Ruth baseball team. Back then, I had played a couple of years Little League, but then Babe Ruth League was where you played on a full-size field. And in those days, not everybody made the team, and my mother never drove me to practice. And we lost the first 3 games. And so our sponsor, coach, manager said, after practice Friday, everybody has to come over to my house for a team meeting. We rode our bikes. Our mothers didn't drive us. I should stop saying that. And we went down the basement to the rec room. Knotty pine paneling, 7-foot Celotex ceiling, ping pong table, linoleum floor. And pretty much the whole team was there, 18 or 20, 14, 15-year-old jocks. And I'd like some class participation here, especially females. True or false? No one is more obnoxious or arrogant than a 15-year-old jock. So we were there, and we were, by the way, we blamed the coach for losing the game. We certainly didn't blame ourselves. And we wondered what this team meeting would be about. And he said, everybody raise your right hand. I raised my left hand. I've always been that way. He said, we're going to take an oath. And repeat after me. I swear to God that I will never tell anyone the secret that Mr. Bryson will tell us. So help me God. We all looked at each other and rolled our eyes. What? was going to tell us the secret of the infield fly rule or what? But then he drew us in closer. And he whispered these words. This is 1961. We have a bomb shelter. And then he said, and if you win our division, 6 or 8 teams, I will let you see it. Now you laugh. But remember, in those years, Twilight Zone had a show about the bomb shelter. David Susskind hosted the first TV roundtable debate in history, and the topic was, if you had a bomb shelter and the Russians attacked, would you allow your neighbors in? And furthermore, my father was a building contractor. He built houses and apartment buildings, not bomb shelters, because he said they were foolishness. They wouldn't work. But they cost, in those days, $10,000. The man's house cost $20,000. 5 new Ford or Chevys would cost $10,000. Think about the value of your home, everyone, in 2019. Would you spend half that amount on a bomb shelter? No. Now think about the American people who put up with 500 killed per week for 2 years. And think about people who built bomb shelters for half the price of their home. That is a nation that's afraid of Russia. That's a nation that's afraid of communists and Russian missiles. Recall that in 1957, the Russians put up Sputnik, the first nation to do anything in space. And the American educational system, boy, we better teach more science. And so at that time, that was the mood of both Republicans and Democrats. Again, not only the party leaders, but the grassroots. And in the 1960 election, I guess I was 8th grade or something, Nixon and Kennedy tied, much like they tied in the popular vote. And so the nation was really divided between Republicans and Democrats, but they were united with their anti-communist feelings. Now, with that in mind, remember that the United States made a solemn promise to South Vietnam, and the Senate ratified it by 82. There were some abstentions, obviously, back then. Only 96 senators, so about 13 didn't want to vote or were on vacation, but only 1 senator voted against it. During the Eisenhower administration, in the late Eisenhower administration, we decided to help Vietnam, mainly with agricultural and urban planning. And Eisenhower sent 800 Army troops in the late 50s and 59 and 60 to Vietnam to train their military. 800. When John F. Kennedy took office, and by the way, now I'm one, as President Zimmerman said, myths and truths. Here's the first myth of the Vietnam War. And, by the way, as she introduced, after I was injured in Vietnam, I spent a year at Walter Reed, and they decided that they weren't going to do any eye operations. So I got out. I went to blind rehab, which was a great VA program. And then I went to New York City in search of a great eye doctor. And that was about 1970 or 71. And I began to speak out. That's when John Kerry and his group began to say that I was a murderer and a drug addict. I wasn't. I was neither. And so I wanted to defend Vietnam veterans. And I also felt deeply, which I'll get into later when we talk about the war itself, that President Nixon's idea was the right idea, to literally train and equip, much like they say we're doing in Afghanistan now. But in Vietnam, we really did it. And so I began a group. I went on TV in New York and gave a speech, and the president called me, and I worked for him for about a year and a half, defending the Vietnam policy. I was on a speakers list with, at the top was Spiro Agnew, at the bottom was John Todd. And I toured the country, and I had a great time. I gave speeches, I wrote my own press releases. They never told me what to say. They did give me some inside information occasionally, and the president called me and wrote me letters. He wrote a letter to me when I got married. And I visited the White House several times. I'll tell you about one of those in a minute. But when I would go out, usually to a town meeting, and I did that a lot, in the New York City area, in Washington, D.C., and every time, before I would speak, in the front row would be a middle-aged lady, lovely lady, and she would stand up with tears in her eyes and say, "If John F. Kennedy had not been assassinated, he would have pulled all the troops out of Vietnam. There would be no Vietnam War." And then everybody would cheer. And what could I say? I was the curmudgeon there, speaking for President Nixon. So what I would usually say is I'd say, "Ma'am, I disagree with you." And then I would talk about the president's program, about my experience in Vietnam. Now that is myth number one. John F. Kennedy was a zealous anti-communist. John F. Kennedy was a charter member in the 50s of Friends of Vietnam when they were fighting against the French. And when he took office, remember the 800 American Army men in Vietnam who were training the Vietnamese? John F. Kennedy increased the number to 11,000. And they weren't trainers. They were fighters. Now, as a matter of fact, Kennedy and Nixon, they came into Congress in 1946. And one Democrat, one Republican, and they both were on the same House committee. Since they were the junior members, they were the bookends of House Labor Education Committee. But they became friends. They were friends until they both died. As a matter of fact, before the nomination, John F. Kennedy told Nixon this: "Dick, if I do not get my party's nomination, I will vote for you." And JFK's father told the same thing to Nixon. And I'll ask President Zimmerman to come up. So remember, Eisenhower sent 800 advisors to the Vietnamese army who were specifically limited to training. John F. Kennedy bumped it up to 11,000, and they were given power to shoot. Now, we all remember where we were on November 22nd, 1963. I'm going to tell you where John F. Kennedy was 2 hours before he was assassinated. He was in Fort Worth giving a speech to some businessmen. And now I'd like President Zimmerman to read the selection it's in highlighted.
Okay.
And this is from a book by Christopher Matthews, noted conservative. And he wrote a book, Kennedy and Nixon, the rivalry that shaped post-war America. By the way, it's a great book. And now, please.
He was at the end what he was those first months after VJ Day, a cold warrior. Without the United States, South Vietnam would collapse overnight, he had said at the Fort Worth breakfast.
Thank you. So the last official words that John F. Kennedy ever uttered were Vietnam would fall, Vietnam would collapse without our support. That's myth number one. Now let's move to myth number two. Again, think of me, I don't know, I was 25, I guess. I had been a pilot in Vietnam, and I was working for the president defending his policy, and I would speak to groups. And here's what would happen. After the nice lady who told me that JFK would pull all the troops out, next to her was a gorgeous hippie-looking girl, fresh from the SDS movie, and she would stand up with equal tears in both eyes. And here's what she would say. Ho Chi Minh is the George Washington of Vietnam. He is fighting for the liberty and freedom of his people. He is not a communist. And then she would sit down and everybody would cheer. And what would John say? I'd say, ma'am, I disagree with you. And she would snark back, don't call me ma'am. So, okay. Now, I have a bibliography that I'm going to provide to President Zimmerman that she'll put on the website for the Historical Society, and then anybody can contact me. It's 4 pages long. I read a dozen books, plus my own experiences. And I read 3 modern Vietnam historians. D.R. Sardesay, professor emeritus from UCLA, an acknowledged expert on Southeast Asia, wrote a book, Vietnam Past and Present. He says this about Ho Chi Minh. Sardesay, the historian, calls Ho Chi Minh that old Bolshevik who instituted forced collective agriculture in North Vietnam. The second book that I read was by, these are big history books, Michael Kort, who wrote the Cambridge Essential Edition, History of Vietnam. And he traced the geographical and political ideological journey of a young Vietnamese man by the name of Nguyen Sinh Cung, who lived in Hue and Saigon. He was from a Mandarin family. He left Vietnam and went to England, worked on a ship, worked in restaurants. Then he went to France in the early 20s, and he became a founding member of the French Communist Party. Indeed, Nguyen Sinh Cung agitated at the Workers' Party meeting, that was their old name, French Workers' Party, said, no, we should call ourselves communist. And they did. And he was so eloquent that he got a scholarship to Moscow U and was further indoctrinated in Russia under Stalin. And he became a radical Marxist-Leninist there. And indeed, they chose him to be a clandestine Comintern agent. They sent him back to Asia, to China, where he worked with the early communists leading up to Mao. In 1941, his Soviet handlers sent him back, and he went to his home country, this time to the north, Hanoi. And he did lead some popular Vietnamese with some skirmishes against the Japanese. And so he got a little bit of the title of nationalist. However, then, again, his name was Nguyen Sinh Kung. He formed the Viet Minh. By the way, Minh, I believe, is a Vietnamese word for liberty or freedom. He formed the Viet Minh, and he then took the name Ho Chi Minh. Now, by the way, I always thought it was the opposite. I thought Ho Chi Minh was their leader, and then they called themselves the Viet Minh. No, it was just the opposite. And then, beginning in 1945, when the Japanese left, he began to consolidate his power. And the first mission of Ho Chi Minh was to eliminate the nationalists, because Lenin taught that there's nothing worse than nationalists, because the goal is world domination. He not only, he killed some of them. I don't think he killed as many good people as Stalin did, but he killed some of them, and he certainly sought to throw roadblocks in any nationalist ideas. So, myth number 2. Ho Chi Minh was not George Washington. Ho Chi Minh was Nguyen Sinh Kung, a communist since his early years. Now, the third myth, again, and I'm sorry if I'm boring you with all my 50 years ago debates on the Vietnam War. Again, back to that nice crowd of people. Someone would jump up and say, it's an undeclared war. It's illegal. Now, the first issue, and maybe later we can debate this, but the United States Supreme Court in a case, early case, the prize cases, decided in 1868 after the Civil War, dealt with this issue. And I love this. By the way, let me check the time.
The time is 8:33 p.m.
Really, it's only 7:35. But my watch didn't reset after, and it was 2 minutes slow in the first place. Now, here's what happened. You will recall that Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. And the Republican Party platform was really an abolitionist platform. And it took a longer time to count the votes. But by Christmas of 1860, in South Carolina, they knew that Abraham Lincoln had been elected, and they knew that he was going to abolish slavery. And they seceded, and in their ordinance of secession, they wrote this: we can no longer stay in a union where the elected leader is committed to the destruction of our institution. Those of you Civil War history guys, you know the South always called slavery our peculiar institution. Now, and the Southern states seceded. In April of 1861, you will remember, again in Charleston, South Carolina, P.G.T. Beauregard fired the first shots in April of 1861. Congress was not in session then, because half of Congress went back to the southern states and the northern guys went back home too. Lincoln began the naval blockade of all southern ports. As a lawyer, I can tell you, and I've checked this, a blockade is officially an act of war. He also engaged at the Battle of Bull Run in May of 1861. Congress did not come back. the northern men. And on July 4th of 1861, they declared war on the southern states. Congress declared war. Now, as you know, the blockade, the brave US Navy and the Leatherneck Marines seized ships, any ship going in and out of southern ports. And among them were a lot of English ships. And when they were prizes of war, which is what they were called because a blockade is an act of war, the United States owned the ships and owned the cargo that were worth millions. Later, and this is why I love the English lawyers came to our Supreme Court and they held up our Constitution. And they pointed to Article 1, the Congress article. And it said, the Congress shall have the power to declare war. And then they said, Abraham Lincoln waged war for 90 days, 3 months, without a declaration of war. We want our ships back and we want the money. The Supreme Court ruled that's not what the Constitution meant when it said declare war. It doesn't mean the president needs permission. The president has a duty to defend the country. We were at war. The Southern people shot at us and left the Union. So first of all, legally speaking, and by the way, the United States has been in a lot of wars. Only about half of them were declared. And so legally speaking, we don't even need a declaration of war. By the way, do we have any World War II veterans? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
we do.
And I'm sure many of you have saw Saving Private Ryan. And we just celebrated the 75th anniversary of D-Day with many great heroes of that heroic day. What would you say if by the way, was D-Day and World War II in Europe a war, everyone, true? We never declared war on Nazi Germany. We did declare war on Japan, but catch this. When FDR gave that famous speech, December 7th, the date that will live in infamy. The most important part of his speech was at the end. Here's what he said, a quote. I want the Congress to declare that a state of war exists between the United States and Imperial Japan. He did not say, please, Senate, please, members of the House, give me permission to fight the war. Now, in Vietnam, we did indeed have what serves as a declaration of war. By the way, there's never been any official document form. Remember, we had troops in Vietnam. We had our great US Navy off the shores of North Vietnam and some in South Vietnam, just watching, waiting. And in August of 1964, 2 Navy ships thought they were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 4 days later, strike. After that, Lyndon Johnson directed his Democrat friend J. William Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, draft something, get it passed so I can clobber those people. And as you know, LBJ didn't use the word clobber. And so originally it was called the Fulbright Resolution. Later, they changed it to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And here's what it says. The president may take whatever measures he deems necessary to repel aggression in Southeast Asia. Now, when I was a 17-year-old freshman college poli-sci major, one of my professors postulated that, and he gave us what he had heard from inside sources, a closed meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. On the committee, of course, Chairman Fulbright was a Democrat. The ranking member was Senator John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky. And he was the ranking member. And in a closed session, he read the draft of the Fulbright Resolution and said, Mr. Chairman, that really sounds like a declaration of war. Fulbright had one word answer. Yeah, yes. Now, later, in 1972, when I worked for President Nixon, I was assigned by Chuck Colson, and he was quite a manager then. You had to hit a home run every time. He wanted me to lobby Congress, the Senate. So I got a friend of mine, another Vietnam vet whom I met at Walter Reed, a double amputee, special forces officer, in a wheelchair. And me, a blind guy, pushed his wheelchair around the Senate. And we met with Senator John Sherman Cooper, who said, you are quite a pair of lobbyists. And then we talked. And I said, Senator Cooper, I heard that some people said you were trying to trick Chairman Fulbright when you got him to admit it was a declaration of war. He said, oh, no. That was a colloquy. A colloquy lawyers use, it's a script. So normally when you see lawyers in court and they're with their witnesses and questions go and the answers come, it sounds smooth. That's all rehearsed. It's a colloquy. And Cooper said this, Senator Cooper said, we created that in order to communicate clearly what the measure was. So there was a declaration of war. So that's myth number 3. Now let's go to Vietnam. And between 64 and 68, and many of you saw the movie with Mel Gibson, We Were Soldiers Once, where the 1st Air Cavalry Division for the first time met North Vietnamese regular troops and had a battle in the Ai Drang Valley. By the way, I've flown over that spot on a combat mission. Now, later, 64 and 65, President Johnson sent over 500,000 American troops to Vietnam. We have Vietnam veterans here. Do you think the Vietnamese people could ever lose or misunderstand the fact that the United States military was there and was there to fight for them? I mean, aircraft, helicopters, jets, big, ugly C-130s, just all over the skies. American troops all over. However, during that time, the United States had no strategy. On my list of books, there was a book by an Army colonel called On Strategy, and ironically, the title is ironic because he felt there was no strategy. That was because Secretary of Defense McNamara, who Johnson inherited from Nixon, who was supposed to be one of the whiz kids, thought of war as a chess game of communication. He said, we'll bump up some troops to communicate to the enemy that we mean business. We'll drop some more bombs, or we'll halt the bombing. He halted the bombing 16 times, then resumed it. He put strict regulations on where we could go and where we could fight and where we could bomb and attack. And one of those was very interesting. No, during the Johnson administration, there was no American bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong and the railroad from China. That was off limits. I guess McNamara didn't want to communicate that. Think back to the bombing of Germany, or the firebombing of Tokyo, or even the atomic bombs. At the Pentagon at the time, there were World War II veterans. McNamara admitted that he would pit them against each other, the Army against the Marines, the Air Force against the Navy. And then he'd throw up his hands and he'd say, oh, okay, I'm going to do this. He admitted in his book that he lied to President Johnson. Oh, yes, Mr. President, I'm ordering new policies to win the war. Johnson would say, win that blankety blank war. So for about 4 or 5 years, 500,000 American troops, Army, Air Force, Marines, Navy, were rudderless and were held back, literally. Now, we come now to the great watershed moment in 1968, the Tet Offensive. And this is myth number 4. The myth goes like this. Tet was a communist victory and a disaster for the Americans and the South Vietnamese. And that's what you saw on TV. I got to Vietnam after Tet, so I was in flight school in Alabama. And being a political junkie even back then, I would go watch the Huntley Brinkley News. And during the Tet Offensive, I remember one cryptogram, or whatever they call them nowadays, just a map of Vietnam. And on it were 100 little red fires, and they signified all of the cities and American bases that the North Vietnamese had attacked. And get that picture on your TV. But there was another picture on your TV. In Vietnam, there was no real media censorship. And we had the beginning of communication satellites and TV video. The second thing that American people saw on their television, and let me see how to, well, I'll phrase it this way. An American mother could see on her TV in living color her son die in Vietnam. An American World War II vet father could see his Army and Marines losing a war. The best man at my wedding, another Army helicopter pilot, wonderful guy, was shot down in an LZ. He had a head wound. He later, at the Vanderbilt University, it's a great place, they have all of the TV news casts. And he went down there, worked for a year, and he found an ABC News film of him being littered on a litter put into a medevac helicopter with blood all over him. And they could recognize his patch and his name. They knew who their son was. Now think of that. That is the picture that the Americans had of the Tet Offensive. Number one, we were losing. Number two, Americans you saw them dying. In 1968, we also saw scenes of the Marines at Khe Sanh, surrounded, under siege for about 6 weeks. What we really did, although I guess we saw it, the fact that they didn't surrender, that the Marines were stoically fighting, we didn't see the American Air Force, the modern American Air Force, do a terrific job of keeping the enemy at bay. Walter Cronkite also mentioned that we didn't see Vietnamese troops also fighting. And we did not see the magnificent operation of the first aircraft. Imagine this, 400 aircraft, 15,000 Army infantrymen come to Khe Sanh I can't even imagine the organization and the skill that required. We have a gentleman who flew a helicopter there. We didn't see that on television. What we saw was that America was losing the war and that our sons were, you could see them dying in living color. So after that, many Americans, probably some of you, I'm sure, in good faith decided that the war was not winnable, that the war was wrong, that the war wasn't worth it. And so too did the Democratic Party. You will recall their convention in Chicago, the riots, and their platform stated, the goal is a negotiated settlement. That's all they said. They didn't say win the war. They didn't say do anything, train troops. They just said negotiate a settlement. Think of Lyndon Johnson. In 1964, he'd won a landslide victory. 4 years later, after Tet, he was afraid to come out of the White House because of reporters and or protesters. And Lyndon Johnson believed his generals, who told him the Tet Offensive was the biggest mistake the communists ever made. Here's why. By the way, they were correct. The North Vietnamese sent 130,000 regular North Vietnamese army troops, and they were good troops. But they put their Viet Cong, their southern supporters, in front. And after Tet, a month or two, most of the Viet Cong were killed. And a lot of the South Vietnamese people didn't appreciate that, including the 5,000 that the communists killed, massacred in Hue. When I got to Vietnam in late '68, I never saw Viet Cong. I saw regular North Vietnamese army in uniforms with weapons, and there were a lot of them. But our television and media sold the Americans that we were losing the war, that it was a horrible war, that it was a mistake. And that's myth number 4. Now, I've thought about this a lot, and I know you've noticed that I'm wearing a medal. And this medal I didn't include in my biography. This is the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Bronze Star, one of their highest heroic medals. And the myth that I'm going to talk to you now about, and again, I heard this myth back when I worked and debated the anti-war leaders. Myth is American GIs hated the Vietnamese. They didn't care about them at all. I have a friend. He was a Green Beret officer, but he wasn't sent to the 5th Group to make war. He was sent to train Vietnamese troops. He lived with them for a year. He came back to the United States, got out of the Army. For a few weeks, he and I traveled around, and he was a sincere supporter of President Nixon. Then he told me one day, John, I'm going back to Vietnam. I said, you joined up again? He said, no, I'm going with Catholic Relief Services to help the people of Vietnam. I said, are you crazy? And he said, John, I love those people. He went to Vietnam for a year with Catholic Relief Services. He actually went out with his old unit and called in artillery on the radio for them. He also worked as an AP stringer because he could read and write. Then he came back. He then, a few years later, when there was no more South Vietnam, he went to Cambodia with Catholic Relief Services to help the Cambodian people in the killing fields. After a year, he came back. And then he really heard the call, and he became a priest and a Jesuit. And he's now a college professor in Boston. So he and I have a lot more in common. But I'll never forget, said John, I love those people. Now that's one guy. Now I'll tell you about another guy. I was drafted. I went to Tiger Land down in Fort Polk to be an infantryman. 16 weeks of infantry training. At the last day, our sergeant said, the 200 of us were there, he said, good news is everybody gets 30 days leave. Bad news is you're all going to Vietnam as an 11 Bravo, an infantryman. And then he said, except, and he called my name and a few others. And I got to go to officer candidate and flight school. And I trained because my father said, learn everything you can because your life will depend on it. And so I trained hard. And I trained hard as an American infantryman and as an American helicopter pilot. And I trained with all American people, and I trained with all American weapons and aircraft. And when I got to Vietnam, I lived in a tent, at first with a mud floor, but surrounded by concertina wire and claymore mines and bunkers and machine guns. And I lived with about 300 other Americans. And every day, well, gunship pilots only flew 4 days a week because you need rest if you're flying combat. Every time I flew in support of American troops in 68, 69. Because under the Johnson-McNamara administration, those 500,000 Americans had taken over the war. The Americans were fighting the war. When I was wounded later, 1,500, a strike, 300 Americans were killed in that week. Me and 1,400 others were wounded in 1 week. That's because we had the total war. The Vietnamese, I never saw Vietnamese military men. We had some women who cleaned up. We would say hi to them. We had one lady that did our laundry. Those are the only Vietnamese I knew. Those are the only Vietnamese I saw till one day. In our gunship platoon, we would have what was called a primary team that would, here's what we do. We check the board, find the tail number of our aircraft at night at about dusk. We'd put our helmets and our weapons in the aircraft. And then for 24 hours, or well, really maybe only 18, during the night and the next day, daylight hours, we would keep our clothes on and our boots on. And we had an Army field phone. And when it rang, 4 of us, 2 pilots, 2 co-pilots, would run up to the aircraft, and I mean run. And we would jump in. Very often, I would even forget to put my harness on. And we'd crank the jet engines. And we'd get off as quickly as possible, no matter what was on the runway. And then we would I'd call the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, get a radio frequency for the people who were in trouble. And what that scramble meant, when that phone rang, here's what it meant. It meant that somebody, and we thought usually it was American troops, were in deep doo-doo. And so we hurried. Well, that time I called the command center. I got the frequency, but the call sign wasn't an American frequency. It was strange. I forget what it was. And they told me, by the way, I'd study the map every day and find out where people were. And they sent me to a place where Americans weren't. When I got there and I called them, an American came on the radio. I heard 2 things. I'd heard it before. First thing was a lot, or in Vietnamese, beaucoup gunfire, because the guys on the radio. Boom, 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 a lot. And then I heard this fine young, probably American MACV sergeant or lieutenant who was a good bass in his chorus, but he was a soprano, and he was screaming bloody murder. And when we got there, I saw the battlefield. There was a convoy on the road. Those were the good guys, and they were surrounded by a whole lot of the North Vietnamese army. They'd bumped into each other, I don't know. And again, I will say, I'll admit it, as George Bush would say, I misunderestimated the enemy. And on my first rocket run, I came in too low and beaucoup enemy fire. And I was hit a couple times. Fortunately, no, neither me or the co-pilot were hit. And we could still fly, limping a little bit. The wingman came in low too because he had to cover me. And when we got up to altitude on our VHF radio, how you doing? 3-7. He said, I think I've got a hydraulic failure, which is basically power steering. We had to go back. We couldn't do it. I was hit. I felt a little loss of power, but I felt okay. I called my unit. I said, get 2 birds armed and refueled because we're coming back. We flew about 10 minutes, landed, almost crashed. We ran to the new aircraft. And I mean, we ran. And then we flew out there as fast as we could. That helicopter pilot I mentioned will remember the N2 RPM. By the way, in a jet engine, we had a little gauge that said you could go over 100% power. Well, we pushed it to make it as fast as we could get out there. And by then, when I called back, I didn't talk to an American. It's a Vietnamese guy who didn't speak English. But he didn't have to tell me. We knew where the bad guys were. This time we were more cautious, and we stayed for a long time and expended a lot of rockets and tens of thousands of bullets. And we saved the day, I will say. A few days later, it was one of my off days where I would read or go surfing or something. Radar O'Reilly, you know him, the company clerk came down and said, sir, you got to come down and see the major. I got down there. There was a MACV lieutenant. MACV was the unit that trained the Vietnamese. He said, hey, they want to give you a medal. I said, what? Well, you saved their bacon. They want to give you a medal. Oh, okay. So he said, I'll come back tomorrow at noon and we'll drive out there. It was about 15 miles away. I said, hey, we'll fly out there. We don't ride in Jeeps. And this is it. This is the medal. And I began to think about it. Remember when he first said they want to give you a medal, what did they talk about? But then I thought about that group of ARVN troops, Vietnamese troops, were about maybe 100. Later we found there was a North Vietnamese regular battalion. They were outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. And they fought hard. They had some trucks where they could, take a little bit of cover, and they had us. And I fought with them. There's something about that bond. And I cared about those people. And 58,000 Americans cared so much that they died. So please don't dare tell me that we didn't care. That's number 5. And let me double check.
The time is 9:05 p.m.
That's an hour. Can we go a little longer? President Zimmerman?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. I'll give you the last 2 myths quickly. The first myth, or maybe I think it'll be the last. Yeah, I'll do the last one. In 1975, the North Vietnamese made their last invasion. In 1973, the United States, under President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, and President Thieu of South Vietnam, made an agreement with the North Vietnamese. And it said that all North Vietnamese would go back to North Vietnam and all Viet Cong would put down their weapons and the North Vietnamese would respect the sovereignty of South Vietnam. Before the ink was dry, and I've got a history book that tells this exactly, the author translated hundreds of North Vietnamese documents, the Politburo and the PAVN, their army. They began planning the final assault with Soviet help immediately. But they waited. They waited for over 2 years. But remember another great date in American history, June 17th, 1972, the Watergate break-in. In November of 1972, probably thanks to my great rhetorical efforts, President Nixon won the biggest percentage landslide in American history. His opponent, George McGovern, was a sincere anti-war candidate. I met him once. Quick story. I gave a speech to the veterans of foreign wars, 7,000 of them. This was in the middle of August of 72, right before the election. And I correctly said that George McGovern, his plan to end the Vietnam War is actually the North Vietnamese plan. And it was, point by point. And then I said to these vets, well, gentlemen, the lines are drawn. And they gave me a standing ovation. And since I was blind, the VFW guy, I took his elbow and we went to the wings. And there was I could see a little bit. I saw a gentleman, he had one of those hats on, and he said, excellent speech, John. And so I said, oh, well, thank you. Who's that? He said, George McGovern. He had to come follow my act. And I thought of like saying, gee, I'm sorry. I don't know. But I didn't because I couldn't say anything. And here's what he said to me. The war must end, John. We must end the war. He believed that. I respected that. But anyway, the North Vietnamese, they didn't want to end the war. They waited. So in 1974, the Democrats won veto-proof Congress. Here's what happens in America. November of even-numbered years, we have federal election, we get a new Congress. The first week in January, they all go back to Washington, they count heads, they say, Democrats are in the majority, Republicans in the minority, and they both go to caucus rooms and they decide what they're going to do, their agenda. And in 1975, January, Democratic caucus, and I don't mean to offend people, they said, after what Nixon had done, and what Johnson had done, and what Nixon's Watergate was, they didn't like it. And they said, no more money for Vietnam. Well, in Hanoi, the Soviets said, this will be a good time for a spring attack. And they attacked in early March. And it ended on April 30th. The Vietnamese army, even without our help, low on fuel, ammunition, and food, fought longer than the French did against the Nazi blitzkrieg. They fought longer than the Polish people did against the Nazi blitzkrieg. And it was a blitzkrieg, the secret of that last battle. The Vietnam War was really a small unit infantry war, a guerrilla war. But in the 2 years after the peace accord was signed, Soviets brought in hundreds of tanks and heavy artillery. And they didn't infiltrate the jungle. They had 4 main routes. And when I read this one book called Black April by a man who analyzed the whole thing, he not only had North Vietnamese army accounts, he had South Vietnamese army. And one of the attacks came right through my old area. I could see myself in all of these cities that the tanks swept through. Well, it didn't sweep through, 6 weeks worth, 7 weeks. The Vietnamese held, often hand to hand. They were brave and they fought well. But now our American TV, I'm sure all of you remember. And on April 30th, you saw people scrambling up to get into helicopters and fleeing the US Embassy. You didn't see the 7 weeks of battle that the brave Vietnamese put forth. Myth number 6, the Vietnamese were cowards who didn't fight. Believe me, they fought. I want to thank you. President Zimmerman, I don't know about questions or time. Tell me what to do.
Do we have any questions from the audience? For Dr. Todd? Okay, right over here. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. Nick Lexon, I'm a friend of John's. I read so many books on there, and I was in Pleiku infantry. My 2 cousins on 1st KF with about 8 or 9 relatives in Vietnam. But one thing that always bothered me over there, and I was in Pleiku, John, in infantry, and was reading about with the Marine Corps, and I think it was General Cushman, and how Johnson wanted, you talked about Operation Pegasus, where the 15,000 infantry came to open up Khe Sanh, but the Marine leadership did not want to fight that kind of war, and they fought Westmoreland at every turn. Hold on, every turn, let me finish it. Okay, every turn, and I just wondered, would we have been better off if we had had one command instead of so many different elements involved? Thank you.
Thank you.
The main thing was, again, Robert McNamara admitted it in his book. And on my bibliography, I got 2 books about, one was On Strategy by the Colonel, the other one, H.R. McMaster's book, The Lies, about how we conducted the war. He pitted the Marines and the Army against each other. More so than you see in World War II movies where sailors, Marines, Army guys would get drunk and fight each other. He had the generals fighting each other. That's why, Nick. The policy was bad. Thank you, Nick.
Any other questions?
Speculated that Vietnam was a means of testing new modern weapons that was different from World War II, an evolution of military warfare. Did you find that to be a factor in the war?
That's sort of the same, I'll give the same answer as I did to Nick. Yes. By the way, in World War II, they had a bolt-action rifle. Obviously, in Vietnam, we had the M16, a fully automatic weapon, a great weapon. If you didn't put 20 cartridges in the magazine, if you put 15 in, it worked great. So yes, to a degree, and certainly Army helicopter gunships were a great advancement. But that is not why we went. Now, there were obviously people who made money. Wars make money. And people who manufacture weapons make money. But I believe that we were fulfilling the treaty and that we were acting in good faith. And by the way, we did develop some new weapons. So that's the answer. Thank you.
One more.
What actually area were you in?
In the Central Highlands, who's that?
Pleiku?
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's where one of the offensive one of their strikes came through, bound me to it, and all through the area. And then they went on to the final last stand at Swan Lock, which was about 20 clicks from me, 50 miles down the road. So again, it broke my heart that not only they fought so hard, but that everybody disparaged them.
John, were you flying?
Don't worry. I've got to go. We got to go.
One more question? Okay, one.
John, this is Dwayne. Where did you do your surfing?
That's what everybody wants to know. Where did you do your surfing?
Oh, by the way, it is now the surfing capital of Vietnam. You can get a hotel and surfing lessons, and it's within a half hour of Saigon.
And it's called,
What?
and it's called,
Oh, Phan Thiet.
thank you very much.
That's all. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.